In my last lecture, I confused you by skipping around between mosques as I focused on different parts of the mosque and how each reflects and reinforces religious faith and practice. Today, I'm going to try to stick with a somewhat more coherent chronology and geography, which means I'm going to confuse you by mixing up different kinds of works. Islamic art includes many universal elements, but it has also changed over time and developed important regional variations, often reflecting earlier art from the same geographical region. So let's dash through a little history. In my first lecture, I talked about the life of Muhammad, his immediate successors, called the Four Caliphs, and the establishment of an Umayyad Caliphate headquartered in Damascus, now Syria. An Umayyad Caliph ordered construction of the Dome of the Rock, completed in 691. The Umayyads, though, lost out to the Abbasids in 750 CE, and by the way, you're very unlikely to need to know all of this except as identification for the work. At any rate, a branch of the Umayyads fled to North Africa and on to Spain, where it established its capital at Cordoba. So here's a map of the Umayyad Empire at its height before its downfall in 750. And here's a map of the Abbasid Caliphate that succeeded the Umayyads. Note that an Umayyad dynasty lived on in Spain. We're going to return to Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain, in a moment. But first, let's pause and talk about Islam as a religion of the book. And for this, we will look at an Abbasid work from North Africa or the Near East. Apparently, they're not sure. This is a required work. It was produced on parchment or processed animal skin, but among the Arab world's many great contributions to the West was actually paper, which it brought to Europe from China via the Silk Road. At a time when monasteries were lucky to possess 5 to 10 meticulously copied manuscripts, Baghdad had an entire street filled with shops selling books with paper pages. The Quran was one of Islam's great unifying forces. It was virtually always printed in Arabic, which helped to create a common language and literature across the Islamic world. The reverence for the word elevated the art of calligraphy, the art of the beautiful hand. Calligraphers underwent years of rigorous training, and the best became famous and wealthy. Most early Islamic texts were written in the Kufic script that you see here. It has bold, angular, even lines, so that makes them easy to read, even at a distance. By the way, if you go into churches and see old choir books that were hand-done, they also have very large, very clear print because the whole choir had to be able to see them from a distance. Arabic, like Hebrew, is read from right to left, and in its written form, it doesn't contain vowels, only consonants. So the red symbols you see here, they're circled in purple, they're a little hard to make out on the slide, are added in vowels that are there to make reading aloud easier. The Quran actually means recitation. This was very much an oral tradition before it was written down, and recitation of the Quran remains a very important element in Islamic practice. In fact, many devout Muslims memorize large sections of, or even the entire Quran. So the 5 gold balls, which I've circled in green, mark the end of a verse of the surah. The surah is a chapter of the Quran. The surah's title is written in gold ink and surrounded by a rectangle decorated with entwined vines. Do you remember the word for that kind of decoration? It's an arabesque. Note that the words are beautifully spaced on the page. Your reading assignment explained how calligraphers used interlines to space the letters properly, something I'd never known before. So now on to Al-Andalus, or Muslim Spain. If somebody forced me to climb into a time machine, if there were such a thing, and then told me I had to go back to the year 1000, but I could go anywhere in that year, I am pretty sure I would choose to dial up Cordoba. It was a city of vast learning, of exquisite architecture and art, and of a cosmopolitan, tolerant environment where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in relative harmony and with considerable intellectual and cultural exchange. So let's watch a video clip that talks about the Islamic culture of Muslim Spain and then takes you on a tour of the Alhambra, which, to my mind, is the most beautiful building that I've ever visited. Of course, I've never been to India, so I haven't seen the Taj Mahal. So all 3 of these are required College Board images. The Alhambra was both the collection of palaces and a military barracks and fortress. Although a fortress was first was first constructed on the site in the 9th century, the Alhambra was rebuilt in the mid-13th century by the Nasrid emirs of Granada. They succeeded the Umayyads with some fighting in between. By then, the Christians had reconquered most of Spain, including Cordoba, and the Emirate of Granada was the last Muslim outpost in Spain. As you can see from the plan, the palace buildings are generally quadrangular, and all of the rooms open onto a central court. So succeeding rulers basically added new quadrangles, but they followed the same plan and the same principle, connecting each with smaller rooms and passages. The unifying theme was paradise on earth, with columned arcades, fountains with running water, and reflecting pools that created an oasis effect. Again, you have a fascination in Islamic art and architecture with paradise, and paradise always included water. Not surprising in a religion that was born in the desert. Note that the exterior was left plain and austere, disguising the beauty that lay within. Moorish poets, by the way, describe the Alhambra as a pearl set in emeralds. Note the white stone against the green gardens. It makes sense to me. The Alhambra represents one of the peaks of Islamic decorative arts. Here you see elaborate filigrees that were carved into stone and stucco. And this is a famous room in the Alhambra. It's the stalactite dome. These hanging decorative features, by the way, were created out of plaster or stucco, not stone. These tiles from the Alhambra reveal what two characteristic elements of Islamic art? More vocabulary here. Well, we see the use of calligraphy as a decorative element, and we see tessellations or repeated geometric patterns. Before I reluctantly leave Al-Andalus, let me talk about the last of our required works from this region. A pyxis is a cylindrical container that held aromatic spices, cosmetics, or even jewelry. This pyxis was a gift to the son of the caliph, probably in honor of his 18th birthday. It was carved from ivory, from an elephant's tusk, that is. That was a beautiful, durable, yet easily carved material, and it was very popular in both Islamic and Byzantine cultures. And understand, at this point, both of these cultures are flourishing. On the right, you see the largest surviving Byzantine ivory panel from the 6th century. Note the calligraphy just below the lid. It reads, "Blessing from God, goodwill, happiness, and prosperity to Al-Mughira, son of the commander of the faithful. May God's mercy be upon you." So, what are we seeing in this central medallion, and what might it mean? We see a lute player flanked by two figures, one of whom holds the braided scepter and flask that was symbolic of the Umayyads, while the other holds a fan. The Khan Academy essay that you read for homework explained that the man with the fan may represent the Abbasids, who were ruling off in faraway Baghdad and had, of course, defeated the Umayyads of Damascus. So this work may be sending the message that the Umayyads and not the Abbasids are really the legitimate rulers of the Islamic world. So here we see two more panels from the Pyxis. So what's the likely significance of a lion attacking two bulls? Well, lions tend to represent kingly power, so this may just be glorifying Daddy the King, but it may also be another reference to Umayyads fighting Abbasids, conveniently ignoring that it was the Abbasids who won. The men on horseback picking dates may also, according to historians, refer to the lands in the east that were lost to the Abbasids. So, why does this Islamic work feature all these human and animal figures? Well, even though the inscription mentions Allah, this is not a religious work, so the prohibition doesn't apply. But it's also true that on the outer fringes, both west and east of the Islamic world, you are more likely to see depictions of humans and animals. Stay tuned for Persian art. So, what might interest the College Board about this work? Why is it on the list? Well, we have that theme of power and authority. Go Umayyads. There's the exception to the rule about aniconic images. There's the influence of Byzantine art on Islamic art, and maybe they just like this work. I do too. So I debated where to put the Golden Haggadah, into which unit that is, and I chose to talk about this Jewish manuscript here. It's a debatable choice, since we will be comparing these pages with Gothic illuminated manuscripts that they closely resemble when we get to Christian art. In fact, just a little foretaste, the French Gothic illuminated manuscript in the upper left shows a king and queen of France. The illustration from the Golden Haggadah at the bottom right shows Moses and Aaron coming before the Pharaoh, who, at least to me, looks a lot like a French king. Some art historians think that the wealthy Jewish family that commissioned the Haggadah may even have hired Christian Gothic artists to produce it, since they were masters at this craft. At any rate, I decided to talk about the work now because medieval Spain was a golden age for Jewish learning and culture. Many Muslim rulers employed Jews as administrators, physicians, and scholars. Now, Muslims conquered Barcelona in 720, but their rule lasted less than a century. Charlemagne's son reconquered it for the Christians in 801. In the succeeding years, however, Jews still made up as much as 15% of the population of Barcelona, and many of these Jews became wealthy leading citizens. They also made up a very disproportionate percentage of learned Barcelonians, including physicians. When the plague hit later in the century, many people blamed the Jewish doctors for causing the plague. In 1492, after their final victory over the Emir of Granada, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella celebrated the unification of Christian Spain by sending Columbus west, you all know that, but also by expelling the Jews. So this work was made just decades before disaster struck this remarkable community. A Haggadah is a kind of storybook used during Passover. So why would it contain human images, something that was as strongly prohibited in Judaism as Islam? And wouldn't you think this was a religious work? Well, as your assigned essay explained, there was a kind of Haggadah loophole. The Haggadah was considered educational rather than religious as a text. Anyway, here you see the plagues descending on Egypt when the Pharaoh refuses to let the Jews leave. The blown-up panel on the right shows a plague of lice. The other panels show plagues of frogs, disease hitting animals, and wild animals. And here we see the Jews escaping from Egypt, starting on the upper left, the Pharaoh ordering the Jews to leave Egypt, the firstborn son starting to die after the Pharaoh changes his mind, the Israelites crossing the separated Red Sea, and finally, this is the section I enlarged since I liked it best, the Red Sea returning and drowning the pursuing Egyptians. I think the lines of that are very dramatic. So finally on this page we see the household preparing for the Passover dinner or Seder. Clockwise from the upper right we have Miriam, who is Moses' sister, joining maidens in dancing and playing instruments. Remember, Moses is the key character in this narrative. Then we see the family cleaning the house for Passover, the master of the house sitting under a canopy, ordering the distribution of traditional Passover foods, matzah, which is unleavened bread, and haroset, which is a sweet made from nuts and fruits that I personally really love. And then we see, it's being distributed to children, which is the tradition. Then we see sheep being slaughtered for Passover while a man purifies utensils in a cauldron over a fire. In the panel I enlarged, which shows the home being prepared for Passover, the man holding a candle searches for leavened bread and the woman and girl clean. In Jewish tradition, all traces of leavened bread, even the smallest crumb, must be removed from the home before sunset on the first day of Passover. So before we move east again to look at the Islamic art of the Mamluks, Ottomans, Persians, and Mughals, some of which will be next lecture, you'll be happy to hear, let's drop south for a moment and revisit Djenné in Mali. This map shows the spread of Islam into Africa starting about 750 CE. Historians aren't entirely sure when the first mosque on this site was built, as early as 1200, as late as 1330. The earliest written record we have of the mosque states that a Sultan Kanburu became a Muslim and had his palace pulled down and had this site turned into a mosque. The original mosque, at any rate, did preside over one of the most important centers for Islamic learning in Africa during the Middle Ages. Thousands of students came to Djenné to study the Quran in the madrasas or schools. Eventually, though, the site was abandoned and fell into decay, or largely abandoned. At the bottom, you see a French journalist drawing of the mosque in 1895. In 1906, the French colonial administration arranged for the original mosque to be rebuilt. Since then, it has been substantially remodeled. The three towers on the Qibla wall were added at the time of the French Reconstruction. The same French journalist who made the drawing you saw in the previous panel described the result as a cross between, I like this, a hedgehog and a church organ. Art historians still debate how much the design reflects the taste of the French administrators as opposed to the beliefs and preferences of the Muslim leaders of Djenné. The overall design certainly does reflect a kind of neo-Sudanese style that was being promoted at the time by the French. They wanted to give a uniform look to all their West African colonies. The walls of the Great Mosque are made of sun-baked earth bricks and sand and earth-based mortar, and they're coated with the plaster that gives the building its smooth, kind of sculpted look. The mosque is built on a platform that's raised almost 10 feet above the level of the surrounding marketplace, shown here. These are the two images that the College Board requires, by the way. The platform prevents damage to the mosque when the Bani River, which surrounds the town, floods. The cone-shaped spires or pinnacles at the top of each minaret are topped with ostrich eggs, a traditional symbol of fertility. The walls of the building are decorated with bundles of palm sticks called torrents that project from the surface, and these also serve as a scaffolding for replastering the mosque. So what's missing from this mosque design? There are towers on the Qibla wall, but there are no minarets. Any guess why? Well, those tall minarets would just crumble too easily. In fact, the towers you see here have dissolved several times since the mosque was built about a century ago, most recently during a major rain in the November of 2009. So let's play the guessing game. What point is the College Board making with the second required image on the lower right? Islam is a communal religion. It's also a religion that accepts, encourages, and was in many ways built on commerce. And the mosque is the center of a community interaction. It houses a school, a market has grown up around it. So here's the image that the College Board didn't require, but I think it should have, because this is what I personally find most fascinating about this mosque. Djenné is located in a river floodplain, and while the weather is generally dry, it does experience monsoon rains as well as floods. So every spring, the mosque must be replastered. The entire community of Djenné comes together at this annual festival, the crépissage. Music, dance, and some serious eating is apparently involved. So just a few interesting additional points about this mosque, especially relevant to how we see works of art differently in different contexts. A few years ago, the mosque, together with the surrounding buildings in the town, was declared a UNESCO World Historical Site. I think that would please the locals. But in fact, in January of 2006, the sight of a team of men hacking at the roof of the mosque to repair it sparked a riot in the town. Turns out there was a lot of anger over outside involvement over the mosque and people continually telling the people of Djenné how they should build or rebuild their mosque. For example, well-meaning, well-heeled Muslims from outside Djenné have repeatedly offered to tile the dirt floor, to put in more modern amenities, and the citizens don't want it. Okay, now we really have to move east and fast. The invasion of European crusaders, not, I should note, a high point in the history of Christendom, increased the fragmentation of Islamic civilization, as would invasion by Mongols from the east. One consequence, to oversimplify some very complicated history, was the rise of the Mamluk Empire. The Mamluks were a group of warrior slaves. They were mostly Turks ethnically, and they took control of several Muslim states and established a dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria from 1250 until the Ottomans conquered in 1517. The Mamluks were not only first-rate warriors, they were also first-rate craftsmen, renowned across the medieval world for their glass, textiles, and metalwork. A master metal craftsman named Muhammad ibn al-Zayn, I almost certainly pronounced that wrong, created this brass basin in the early 14th century. The basin's wide central outer band depicts a finely crafted procession of Mamluk emirs or officials, among them a mace bearer and a bow bearer. 4 horsemen in roundels, that's those round circles, I've labeled it, punctuate the procession of dignitaries. They may be personifications of different aspects of Furusiyya, the Muslim art of horsemanship. Friezes of animals and coats of arms frame the exterior band, and they decorate the basin's interior as well. The basin is a great example of an object that gets produced for one ceremonial context, but later appropriated, repurposed, if you will, for another. And that's my guess as to why it made the College Board cut. The basin was probably commissioned by a wealthy Mamluk patron to serve as a banqueting piece or alternatively as a vessel for ceremonial hand washing. Eventually, however, it ended up in France. I tried to find out how. I couldn't. It may very well be that we don't know. Any rate, once it was in France, the basin was used from at least the 17th century to baptize the children born to the French royal family, including Louis XIII. The various coats of arms on the basin were later worked over with fleur-de-lis, a motif that might have appealed to both the basin's original Islamic and to its later European owners. The flower was a popular Mamluk emblem in the 13th and 14th centuries, but it was also the heraldic device of the French royal family. I'm going to finish up today with the Muslim empire that ended Christian Byzantine Empire, turning its capital of Constantinople into Muslim Istanbul. So let's watch a brief video introduction to this fascinating empire, which ruled much of Eastern Europe and the Middle East into the 20th century. And then I'm going to return to the one Ottoman work we will study, or rather revisit this work, the Mosque of Selim II at Djenné. So I'm actually skipping over the most exciting part of the story of the Ottoman Empire, which is the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453, which was the first major use of gunpowder in warfare. Instead, I'm moving right into the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Suleiman was one of the most fascinating and accomplished rulers in world history, and I'm pretty much going to ignore him and focus instead on his chief architect, Sinan. The next video clip does not show our required work, the Great Mosque at Edirne, but rather the main mosque that Sinan built for Suleiman in Istanbul, shown here on the left, next to our required Mosque of Edirne. And yes, this is an artist who might invite an attribution question. Sinan lived to be 98, and he built over 90 large mosques, 50 smaller mosques, 57 colleges, 8 bridges, and numerous other public buildings throughout the Ottoman Empire. Lots of buildings for the College Board to choose from, although I would bet on a mosque. So Selim II was Suleiman's son. He wasn't much of a ruler. He's mostly known for holding spectacularly extravagant and decadent orgies. But he did have the good sense to employ daddy's architect. Sinan himself considered the mosque to be his masterpiece, and that's saying a lot. So what identifies this mosque as the work of Sinan, and as an Ottoman mosque, a style, by the way, that would be admired and copied throughout the Islamic world? Well, some of the elements I would list would be those tall, pencil-thin minarets, the wide open space under the dome where the mihrab can be seen from every corner of the mosque, and above all, that soaring dome, surrounded by smaller half-domes that form apses or exedrae, those half-circle spaces. So here's the plan of the mosque. This is the College Board required image, but with labels added. Sorry, it's a little blurry. I couldn't find a clearer one. Note that the worship hall is surrounded by outbuildings, a madrasa or school, a cemetery, a dormitory for students, and a covered colonnaded market. The complex also included a hospital and a soup kitchen. The mosque itself is an octagon within a dome, contained within a rectangle that has, an octagon with a dome contained within a rectangle that has 4 iwans, in this case rectangular recessed openings into the corridor. We saw more rounded iwans at Isfahan, and we will see them again in my final lecture. Note also the large courtyard with a fountain for ritual washing. This is an entire religious community. It's the center of communal life as well as religious ritual in the city. So here's a more panoramic view of the huge prayer hall, which shows the half-dome surrounding the central dome. The areas beneath the half-dome are called exedrae, semicircular recesses. In Christian churches, this tend to be called apses, and I think both terms are used. And so here's the dome itself. Note the striped voussoirs and the tessellated designs in the mosaics. Does this remind you of anything? What else echoes the mosque at Cordoba? Well, we see double arches, although they're not horseshoe arches. I'm going to close here with a building that dates from a millennium earlier and a building that we will study out of order but in depth in a future unit. When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, they turned the world's largest building into a mosque. That's when the minarets were built. In looking at Sinan's work, it's very important to understand that much of what inspired and motivated Sinan was a desire to imitate, to equal, and finally to surpass the accomplishments of Byzantine architects, and particularly the Hagia Sophia, which, of course, was the central building of Constantinople, now Istanbul. Again, stay tuned. In my final Islamic art lecture, I'm going to move still further east, and we're going to look at art that also combines Islamic elements with artistic traditions borrowed from other cultures, specifically Persia and India.